Good evening. My name is Mark Barnico, and I'm the Executive Director of the University of Chicago, Francis and Rose Yuan Campus in Hong Kong. Our premier location in Asia, representing UChicago values of free and open discourse, rigorous debate, and the exchange of ideas. Welcome to this series, UChicago Focus. We're broadcasting tonight's event live via Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube from the UChicago Yuan Campus in Hong Kong. If audience members have questions to submit, you can do so through the questions and answer button by first registering on Zoom. I also encourage you to visit our website at www.uchicago.hk and subscribe to our e-news for the latest news and information, or you can also follow us on our UChicago Yuan Campus Facebook page. Tonight we continue the UChicago Focus series, which shares specific areas of expertise, unique research, and questions faculty and students are addressing, as well as little-known activities that are having an impact on our world. These programs will interest you whether you're an alumni, a student, a prospective student, or the general community. Tonight, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Paul Staniland, Associate Professor of Political Science and Chair of the Committee on International Relations. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with the University of Chicago Committee on International Relations, I'll share a brief background. The Committee on International Relations, otherwise known as CIR, has its origins in a conference on the causes and characteristics of major wars, which was organized in 1926 by UChicago political scientists Charles Merriam and Quincy Wright. In 1928, the research papers and collaborations spawned by this conference led to the award of several master's degrees, and thereby the establishment of CIR, now the United States' oldest graduate program in international affairs. Combining rigorous core instruction with an interdisciplinary curriculum, CIR's one-year master's program allows students to explore the complexities of global politics and interact with world-class faculty, scholars, and professionals. Students develop depth of expertise by specializing in two fields of studies and by producing a master's thesis, which is an original piece of research conducted under faculty supervision. Now let's begin our program. Dr. Paul Staniland is an Associate Professor of Political Science and Faculty Chair of the Committee on International Relations. He co-directs the Program on International Security Policy and Program on Political Violence. His research focuses on political violence and international security, particularly in South Asia. Dr. Staniland's book, Networks of Rebellion, Explaining Insurgent Cohesion and Collapse, won several awards, and he has published widely in academic and policy journals. A few of his most recent peer-reviewed articles that caught my attention include Leftist Insurgency in Democracies, published in Comparative Political Studies, How and Why Armed Groups Participate in Elections, published in Perspectives on Politics, Violence and Democracy, also published in Comparative Politics, and 10 Ways to Lose a Counterinsurgency, published in Civil Wars. Dr. Staniland has a PhD in political science from MIT and graduated with his undergraduate degree from the University of Chicago's Political Science Department. Professor Staniland, we're delighted to have you as our guest this evening on our UChicago Focus series. I'll turn the program over to you to share your initial presentation and join you again to share questions from our audience.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Mark. And also thank you to the UN campus for giving me this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen now, and you can tell me if this works or doesn't work. Let's put it that way. Okay. Mark, is that visible? Is that doing the job? Okay.
Yes.
Great. So I thought I would take this opportunity to present some kind of research in progress that I think also speaks to a set of pretty big policy questions and kind of real world challenges, issues, and opportunities that are facing a variety of countries and citizens throughout Asia. So today I'm going to try to mix kind of research and social science with kind of insights moving toward something that can tell us about today, both what is like the past in today's politics and things that seem to be a bit different. So this project is focused in general at a very early stage on how big power competition, things like interstate rivalries, arms races, historically examples like the Cold War, affect the domestic politics, the internal politics of what I'm calling here swing states. That these are countries that are seen to potentially either align with one side in a competition or the other side, or perhaps kind of exist somewhere in the middle in some kind of, either neutral or in between position. Historically, I look at two kind of general periods. The first is that of the Cold War in both South and Southeast Asia. So for this presentation, I borrow from the University of Chicago, has a committee on Southern Asian studies, which is our way of putting together South Asia and Southeast Asia into something called Southern Asia. I'm just going to borrow that because I'm interested in this kind of crescent of countries from Pakistan through the Philippines that both during the Cold War and now to very, very different extents, but still very importantly, have been objects of efforts at influence, leverage, and outreach by larger powers. And so I'm going to present some initial empirical research, both from the historical period of the Cold War and then from the more recent, the last 15 or 16 years. So I'm thinking of kind of post-2005 as really marking the rise of China and the emergence of something with various names like great power competition in Asia again. So what I'm going to do is give a little bit of an overview of how we might think about this topic, kind of what are the outcomes that can emerge for these swing states, often smaller countries, as they deal with much larger powers battling or competing or engaging in rivalry around them. I'm going to offer some early insights from the Cold War period, so going back in history, and then zoom back forward to what, at least in the United States, is often called kind of a new era of competition. But my focus will not be on China or the United States. I'm much more interested in the smaller, though still often very small and very powerful, states of Southern Asia, and kind of how both public opinion and actual policies have evolved in the last 15 years. And then I'm going to conclude with some thoughts on what's different, what similarities might exist, and how we might think about thinking about this problem and this challenge. Okay, so let's step back a little bit. The project is looking then, just to repeat myself, at how these big geopolitics influence smaller or swing states. And so I'm not focused on the big powers themselves. There are plenty of people who can talk about this. I think Mark has mentioned that my colleague John Mearsheimer gave a talk that was, I suspect, very much about these kind of the two great powers and what they're up to. My interest is always a little bit more nitty gritty on kind of who's doing what closer to the ground. And so I'm interested in the countries that are being competed over, not the countries that are necessarily doing the competing. And I want to know when and how these big international forces influence the internal politics of these smaller states. So that will be my dominant focus today. Now, I'm going to argue that understanding these questions will help us understand a lot of these bigger geopolitical questions. I do want to offer a caveat before kind of plowing forward. This is a new early project. I have a book coming out later this year on a totally different topic, and I am sick of that project. So I'm kind of jumping into new research, but this is kind of a first cut, a first skim. And I think I'm trying to use comparisons and data in useful ways, but it's still early. So that I just want to put that out there. Okay, so how might we think about the ways that geopolitics can influence these smaller or these swing states? At one extreme, we can see conflicts emerge where big international competition and rivalry kind of reverberate down inside a domestic political system and generate high levels of instability. The rise of the new order in Indonesia is one example, as kind of the left, the right, the military, Sukarno, different factions within Indonesia were operated within a Cold War context that dramatically heightened polarization within Indonesia, brought outside powers with different interests kind of into a greater role within the political system, or at least able to support one faction over another, and contributed to kind of the massacres and violence in 1965 and 1966. In Thailand, we see, among many other issues, questions about Thailand's role within the Cold War being one of the issues that is driving political instability, social mobilization, political protest, and also military repression and military coups. In Laos, efforts that created a neutral Laos collapse, and Laos plunges into civil war from the late, well, it was kind of there in various ways, but especially from the late 50s, early 60s onward. And there are other examples we can come to. So this is the most dramatic extreme. And these examples are very much clustered from kind of the early Cold War in Asia. And so I'm going to suggest that this is not really happening right now and is less likely, but is one extreme. More common is kind of lower down here, where we get these international issues of competition between other powers becoming an enduring domestic political cleavage, an issue within domestic politics that is kind of recurrent, right? At various points, and I don't want to overstate this, but at various points in Nepal, the question of relations with India, in Bangladesh, the question of relations with India, in Malaysia and Indonesia during the Cold War, kind of the question of alignment within these broader Cold War orders, have all been important within domestic politics. Now, sometimes these can be electoral issues. Sometimes they're deployed by governments as either a justification or rationalization for their behavior, but they either way, they recur as an issue that matters. And so this is kind of, I think, more common and more thinkable, both historically and in the present. Basically, the broader geopolitical context becoming refracted into and embedded in some way within domestic politics of these countries. However, even that may be too much, right? And so in this slide, I look at kind of less dramatic outcomes in which international issues, these either great power competition or major power influence, kind of show up at different points and can matter. In India, for instance, in the 1970s, there was some political mobilization against the United States. The China issue has risen and fallen at different points within Indian politics, but is not, neither of these are like deep enduring cleavages in India's politics, right? Elections are not won or lost for the most part on how parties or politicians array themselves around these questions. In recent elections in Malaysia, Indonesia, at times also in Sri Lanka a little bit, questions of China, Chinese labor, Chinese investment have popped up. In Sri Lanka, issues around India, which is the dominant major power that Sri Lanka has to deal with, have arisen. Even in Pakistan, there has been occasional conversation in elections and claims in elections around things like the terms of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So this is a kind of it's not that these bigger politics are irrelevant domestically, but they're not like structuring domestic politics in a deeper way. And then in plenty of cases, big power competition doesn't really have any domestic salience or role, right? And so I think this is something we want to keep in mind, that in many countries, much of the time, including the United States very much, big foreign policy issues are just not domestically very important, right? Okay, so why might we care? First of all, I think that there's good evidence that the importance of international issues domestically can drive a lot of variation in domestic political stability. The history of the Cold War in Asia and elsewhere often involves insurgencies and military coups and political polarization that, at least in part, are driven by the kind of intensification, the high stakes that come from geopolitics. Less dramatically, but still importantly, we can have electoral politics, different factions aligning with different approaches to foreign policy, kind of, let's say, more pro-India versus more India skeptical, or more China-friendly versus more skeptical of China, right? And then I also want to further argue that from the perspective of international competition, these kinds of rivalries are the most complicated and potentially hard to control and manage when they become interwoven with domestic politics, right? So the origins of the Vietnam War are about domestic political orders in what begins as French Indochina, then becomes South Vietnam, and then expands into Laos and Cambodia. And so when questions of international rivalry are not just about already very challenging issues about deterrence and relative power and territorial disputes, but also get bound up in these domestic contests for power, I think unintended consequences and escalation can become more likely. And so even if you are kind of really mainly interested in the great power politics angle, there are all kinds of potential triggers for unexpected consequences and problematic outcomes as domestic politics and foreign policy kind of get pulled together. So I want to start by just offering a little sketch of how this is played out historically in Southeast Asia and then in South Asia. And I'm going to argue that they actually looked quite different in these two regions. In Southeast Asia, international competition was deeply, deeply consequential for the battle for domestic political power, especially in the early Cold War. We see polarization that, at least in part, and I don't want to overstate the role of the international here, but at least in substantial part, is driven by international questions of international foreign policy alignment. Will countries tilt toward, the American bloc, toward the Chinese bloc, the Soviet bloc, or try to stay out of it altogether, right? These have domestic resonance, and different political actors within these countries had different answers to those questions, which were often settled in bloody and chaotic fashion, right? With crackdowns, insurgencies, revolts, coups, etc., right? What we then see in the mid-70s onward is this period of kind of consolidation and kind of, I guess, a greater clarity between domestic alignments and international alignments. We see the ends of the civil wars in Cambodia, Laos, and then new civil wars begin in Cambodia, but the most Cold War relevant civil war ends in Cambodia and Vietnam with the fall of Saigon and Laos. And you see kind of then already the consolidation of this arc of containment in Southeast Asia, with Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, as kind of generally aligned with anti-communist forces, right? And so this is a very bloody and repressive process often, but it does generate this kind of overlap between domestic regimes and international alignments. So it's much more kind of, there's clarity around polarization. In South Asia, by contrast, there's a lot less domestic polarization around the Cold War and around these kind of big questions of communism and anti-communism. There is a very important exception here, which is Pakistan, which its military aligns itself with the United States in the Cold War and to some extent the British. And you see kind of a very aggressive, fairly preemptive repression of the left. However, more broadly in the region, I think it's fair to say that you don't see the kind of consolidation into camps that you see in Southeast Asia. Instead, you see varieties of neutralism and hedging. India leads toward the Soviet bloc, but is not part of it, and at different points cooperates with the Americans. Nepal and Sri Lanka and Bangladesh are mainly dealing with the question of Indian regional dominance. That's the great power that is kind of most influential in this region in this period, right? Burma essentially kind of retracts itself, or tries to retract itself out of the Cold War. And under the military dictator Ne Win from 1962 until 1988, adopts kind of a very dramatic autarky for various reasons, but one of which is a hope of kind of staying out of the Cold War. And then, as I mentioned, in a number of these countries, Indian dominance is a very important issue, right? Both as a supporter of regimes, so having the backing of the Indians is helpful, but also as a target of nationalist backlash, where India is seen, often correctly in my opinion, as kind of meddling, getting involved in domestic politics. And so these smaller countries in the region often react against it. And so it's a much more kind of murky and muddled picture when it comes to these big Cold War cleavages. And I think in some ways, this is actually gives us a hint of where at least some of contemporary South Asia Southern Asia, I should say, will end up in US-China competition. Rather than tightly aligned or kind of pulling themselves into blocks, we'll see countries pursuing, some countries pursuing some of these varieties of neutralism and hedging, trying not to kind of too tightly align with either side. Okay, so we can maybe draw some very tentative insights from this, right? So we get a greater involvement of these foreign policy issues in domestic politics when governments need outside backers for their own domestic politics, their own stability and survival. So weak regimes that need help will often look to outsiders, right? And their competition will often also look to outsiders. And so this can drive a spiral of international involvement. However, there are also cases in which pre-existing domestic issues have some kind of salience, some kind of resonance with broader international questions. So in countries where there was a big conflict between the left and the right already, the Cold War naturally, or with not that much effort, became linked to those kinds of domestic divisions. With a little bit more effort, like in 1960s Indonesia, we saw the military linking communism with the Chinese ethnic minority, which already was subjected to a lot of suspicion and prejudice. And the Indonesian military then kind of links communism to the already distrusted ethnic minority, right? And so that's a case in which there's some kind of pre-existing grounding that political elites could use to pull in these bigger international issues and fuse them to salient domestic issues. And then, of course, when we're talking about the Cold War, there are all these direct international interventions, covert actions, sponsorship of insurgents, plus more indirect spillover through refugees, cross-border rebels, networks of ideology, and things like that. We saw more insulation, though, from great power politics, whether the US-Soviet kind of Chinese triangle or Indian influence in South Asia, when big international issues just didn't really have any resonance with the key salient domestic issues. They were just seen as basically irrelevant to normal politics, whether by masses or political elites. Also, when governments had the political and material resources that didn't require outside support, where they didn't need to look to foreign patrons. And so they could kind of play their own games and be, at least to some extent, free agents in these kinds of competitions. So now let's pivot back to the present or the recent past. I'm not going to make a strong claim about the nature of what the US-China relationship is. It's complicated. There are a lot of ways we can talk about it. At least in the United States, increasingly, though, we hear about kind of a new Cold War. This phrase, great power competition, is now kind of very much in vogue in Washington. I want to suggest some hesitation about all of these analogies, but just this is the framing that we're seeing increasingly, right? In which there's growing Chinese economic and military influence matched with greater assertiveness, which is then generating responses and counter responses by countries like the US, India, Japan in dialogue with China. So what I want to do is explore how this is played out within the set of Southern Asian countries. So I'm not interested in what America is up to necessarily, or what China's up to, or kind of like 50 years from now, the future of great power politics. I think those are really interesting questions. I'm not discounting them, but I think at least in a lot of American geopolitical analysis, these smaller countries, and some of them are huge, like India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, these are massive countries, right? But just, these swing states are often seen as kind of like pawns on a chessboard, and America's here and China's here, and they're, playing games to win their loyalty or, intimidate them or whatever. And I think that's not the only way to look at it. I want to know what citizens of these countries themselves have to say, right? I want to get a sense of what their governments are up to. Okay, so, and in doing so, I hope to answer, or at least begin to answer this question of what is similar and what's different, right? Okay, so I'm going to start with public opinion. And I think this is an area where social science research has something useful to offer, right? And so I'm going to be looking at something called the Gallup World Poll. So Gallup is the polling agency. They run every year or every other year in all over the world. They run this world poll. And one of the real advantages of it is that they use pretty similar methods and either identical or very similar questions across an array of countries in the same way over time. So let's just look at trends within countries and across them in a pretty comparable way. And I'm going to focus here on 9 countries that I think, at least formally, right, portray themselves as electoral democracies, with the exception of Myanmar. So the data go through 2019. There was obviously a coup in Myanmar. I'm going to be talking more about the implications of that for how we might think about kind of China, the US, India in Southeast Asia, and in Myanmar specifically. So things have obviously changed since these surveys were run, but countries where you could plausibly imagine public opinion perhaps mattering in some way, right? As we're going to see, there are all kinds of gaps and, broken linkages between actual public opinion and real foreign policy. But I think it's a useful starting point. And it's something where, at least I haven't seen a lot of this kind of comparative public opinion over time analysis done. There are some important exceptions, to be sure. So I start with this question, right, which is the dominant question they ask about China, which is, do you approve or disapprove of the job performance of the leadership of China? Now, generally, this question is interpreted as kind of a stand-in for opinions of China. It's not a specific question about like, do you like this leader's specific economic policy versus this other leader's? Or, most respondents have very little nitty-gritty knowledge of like internal Chinese domestic politics. So I think it's a useful stand-in for general opinions. Like, do you think what the leader of China is doing is good or bad, right? And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this chart here. A graph, I guess, right? What I'm doing here is plotting the net approval, that let's call it net favorability of China from 2006 through 2019. So this is a broad swath by a major polling firm asking the same question in the same way using the same method over time. All right, so I think it's useful. There are big limits to survey research. I don't want to overstate, the nitty-gritty accuracy here, but I think as a broad brush, it tells us some important things. And so what we're starting to see, I think, one big takeaway is a growing divergence in public opinion toward China across this region. In some countries like Pakistan, which is the one at the top, the kind of light purple, already favorable, if anything, become a little bit more favorable. In Nepal and Sri Lanka, which are the two coming down, kind of the olive green and the, I don't know, brownish. I don't know if you guys can see my mouse here, but we see fairly positive public opinion, kind of net favorability, plus 35, plus 40, somewhere in there. Similarly, in Myanmar, again, this was taken, the last poll in Myanmar that I have access to is 2019. And so I think actually things have changed or may have changed pretty dramatically in Myanmar in the last few months since the coup. At least the national unity government and people linked to it are becoming increasingly skeptical, indeed hostile to China, because it's seen as a supporter of the military regime. But at least as of this data, there was it and Bangladesh kind of loosely, slightly positive and pretty consistent trend there. What we're also seeing though is a pretty substantial downward tilt in opinion toward China in Indonesia, India, the Philippines, and to a lesser extent, Malaysia. So these are countries, India already has had fairly kind of, there's a historical baseline of skepticism toward China that goes back to the 1962 border war. And so you can see even back in 2006, China, which is this dark maroon, India, which is the dark maroon at the bottom here, was already kind of negative. And it stayed that way. There was some brief, almost, slightly above zero net favorability in the around 2014, and then it's dropped. And I'll show a more close-up view of this a little bit later, but it's now net favorability as of 2 years ago was -30. And I think I'm sure it's lower since. I'll talk more about that. Similarly, Indonesia dropping. The Philippines, which was never super enthusiastic, but has now become at the public policy, or sorry, the public opinion level, very negative. And Malaysia dropping from quite high favorabilities in the early kind of 2006, 2007 into just slightly negative territory as of a couple of years ago. And so obviously there are huge limits to what surveys can tell us. I don't want to push this too hard, but I think it's an important corrective to a couple of ideas. One is that there's like an Asian view of China's rise. There isn't. There are very divergent approaches to the question of China, from very favorable to increasingly hostile and skeptical, right? Second, I think we're seeing some pretty complex patterns that are emerging that I'm going to talk about in a minute. Countries like the Philippines, where public opinion has gone south, but actual foreign policy has been, under Duterte, fairly relatively positive, right? And somewhat different than its predecessor. So we're seeing changes in public opinion, but also sometimes policies that don't match on to those changes in public opinion. Now, one thing I just want to briefly mention here is that there's also a lot of variation in the extent to which respondents say they don't know the answer to this question. And we can think of don't know responses in a bunch of different ways, but some of them is just about do you know about this topic? But another is I don't really, I might know about China, or if we're asking about the US or India, I know that this is an issue, I know something about it, but I'm not really sure how to think about the correct answer because there are a lot of competing trade-offs. So we can think of this also as a measure of ambivalence or the malleability of opinion. And I took a look at some of the don't know rates, and we're seeing more consolidated. So lower percentages saying don't know in Pakistan, in Myanmar, again, before the coup. And then in the Philippines, India, and Indonesia. This is on the side of kind of more consolidated public opinion, at least in these surveys. And less consolidated public opinion where you have a higher rate of don't know responses. So Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Thailand would be in here, has a similar pattern. I view Thailand as basically a military regime, but if you wanted to toss it in as a kind of fig leaf democracy, and then Malaysia has a similar kind of pattern, though with a different trend in public opinion. In general, I also looked in aggregate at don't know response rates across all of these countries in this polling. And it's dropped from a high of 46% 9 years ago to 29% in 2019. I don't know what the 2020 data say. I don't think any surveys done during the coronavirus epidemic. I I'm skeptical of them. Let's put it that way. Things could change. It could be going down further. It could be going up. I don't know. But certainly this suggests kind of a greater consolidation of opinion. More people know about the issue. More people are expressing opinions on it. So where are these opinions coming from? How might we think about some of their sources? Some of them I think are pretty obvious. Big territorial disputes and geopolitical rivalries. So countries where China has active and increasingly active territorial disputes, whether like along land borders or in maritime disputes, you would expect at least some effect of those on public opinion. At the same time, and cutting in an opposite direction, China is crucial to the economic fortunes of large parts of the region, right? Which builds constituencies, and also a sense that China provides opportunities for a country like Nepal, which has traditionally been reliant and landlocked and reliant upon India. The rise of China is a great opportunity, right? To get new market access, to get economic development aid, to get some leverage against your larger Indian neighbor. And so there are different ways in which the China question can become refracted into these domestic politics. And then within these countries, there's some interesting domestic political cleavages that can emerge, that can shape opinions. So in Sri Lanka, for instance, I'm going to show on the next slide, big differences between ethnic groups in views of China as well as India. So I'm going to go to the next slide, then I'll come back to this one. So this is a very good think tank in Sri Lanka ran a survey that looked at opinions of, in this case, perceptions of the countries that are supportive toward the interest of Sri Lanka. And this is broken down by ethnicity, and politics in Sri Lanka have a very important ethnic component. So there was a long-running civil war between majority Sinhala or Sinhalese population and a minority Tamil population. The Tamil Tigers, or the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, were the rebel group that claimed to represent the Tamils, the government predominantly Sinhalese. And so we see some really dramatic differences if we look between these bottom two categories, Tamils and Sinhala. Yellow is India, light blue is China. And we see about a 20% net favorability of India over China among the Tamil minority, and that reverses when we look at the Sinhala majority, okay? There's some other interesting stuff in here. Just on a side note though, in this survey, the countries that Sri Lankans wanted Sri Lanka to emulate as a role model were Japan and Singapore. So, they're not looking to either China or India as like political models or models of economic development. It's Singapore and especially Japan. So there's this ethnic cleavage, and some of this has to do with the fact that China was seen as more supportive of the Sinhala majority government during the Civil War, and has been linked to the kind of a very powerful set of Sinhalese politicians, the Rajapaksa family. Whereas the ethnic Tamils see China as supporting a repressive government, propping up politicians who killed large numbers of Tamils, and India as at least sometimes being more supportive of the Tamil cause. Right. In Myanmar, something I think that we might be seeing right now is increasing skepticism and hostility toward China among opponents of the military regime since the coup earlier this year. So we might see this domestic cleavage now starting to generate opinions about these bigger foreign policy questions. We can also see local nationalism as kind of a spur at times for backlash, whether it's against Chinese labor, Chinese investment, the terms of debt deals. So we've seen that in Myanmar, around natural resource development and extraction, in Malaysia around questions of Chinese labor, in Sri Lanka around the terms of debt. And then we also can see some slight disagreements about how to distribute material benefits. So in Pakistan, which overall has very strong pro-China public opinion, there still could be debates about how to allocate, for instance, the benefits of the China-Pakistan economic corridor by province, by geographical region. So there are these domestic dynamics that are also kind of shaping the way that citizens are looking out at other countries. Now, the question then arises though, well, who cares about this public opinion stuff, right? Does foreign policy have anything to do with public opinion? And that is a great question. There is not a simple answer to it. Sometimes it matters a lot, sometimes it doesn't, right? And so what I do here is I want to look at a couple of trajectories. One in which I think it's fair to say the public has become more skeptical and hostile toward China, and policy is aligned with that, roughly. Another in which the public seems to be becoming more skeptical, but policy is not necessarily matching at the same rate or even in the same direction. And then the set of countries where you have neutral to positive public opinion and foreign policies that I would suggest are also neutral to positive. And these are kind of the classic swing states, generally smaller, though still really big, like Bangladesh is a huge country. Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, Malaysia, for instance, that are looking to generate benefits from these different international big players and try to insulate their internal politics to the extent possible from kind of these broader geopolitical competitions. Though as we'll see, that's easier said than done. Okay, so let's talk about India. Let me just, sorry, what did I do here? Okay, let's talk about India. I jumped ahead somehow. I think it's fair to say that over the last 5 years in particular, going back 10 years even, public opinion has sharply turned against India. I think after the 2020 border clashes that killed 20 Indians and an unknown, at least from the outside, number of Chinese security forces, this seems unlikely to change. If anything, I suspect it's accelerating. And there's some recent kind of polling that suggests, very high levels of hostility and in some cases fear, right, of Chinese, what's framed in Delhi as Chinese revisionism, Chinese aggression on the border. This is against the historical backdrop of the 1962 border war, which was an Indian defeat that generated very high levels of ill will toward China. I have some historical data with all kinds of big problems with it, but that looks at Indian public opinion, urban Indian opinion toward China over the course of the Cold War. It took like 25 years for opinion of China in India to get back to just like neutral after the 1962 war. And we have started to see greater pushback toward China among Indian policymakers. The quadrilateral, security dialogue, links to the Japanese, the Americans, the Australians, kind of efforts to talk about basically the fact that from India's perspective, you can no longer separate the border disputes from the broader bilateral relationship. And they're all indicators of some kind of real change in India's foreign policy in the last, several years, against a backdrop of actually already changing public opinion. So this is a case where public opinion was changing before, I think it's fair to say, public opinion was changing before actual policy was changing. Now, there are all kinds of questions here, like what are India's capabilities? How much can it afford? What is its kind of appetite for, engaging in serious rivalry with China? How much does public opinion actually matter on this issue, right? Like if Narendra Modi tomorrow said, I've cut a deal with China that's satisfactory, we're done here, it's very possible that many of his supporters would say, great, okay, that issue is over. Possible. We just don't know some of these questions. But just to give a sense, what I plotted here, the red is don't know response rates. And so the lowest this can be is 0. And at its high point was very high in around 2010. I mean, at least in these surveys. And we see this in other surveys of the Indian public around foreign policy. Don't know rates have dropped dramatically in the last decade. And so now for this survey, at least, it's around 30% by 2019, or 2018 is this one. And I think in general, you've seen China rising as just an issue in general. Also the spread of communications technology, kind of just more ways to get information. And so don't know response rates down. This is in line with data I showed earlier about general don't know rates across the region declining. And net favorability was never great. I think it goes slightly above 0 in 2014, and now it's -30 as of 2018 or 2019 in this case. Sorry, this is 2019. And I suspect now it's lower. So there was a period of kind of ambivalence or disinterest earlier, and I think we're seeing now a downward trend line. There are other countries, however, where it's not clear what the relationship is between public policy and public opinion. Right, Myanmar, we have no idea right now what actual public opinion is, but anecdotally, suggestively, it seems very plausible that it's much more China skeptical than the government's policy is. In part because the government, the military regime, has aligned itself with China, right? And so this is a case in which these linkages are just completely broken. And so the data from Myanmar may tell us nothing moving forward because this is a new kind of regime and a new political environment. And then there are plenty of places, and this is true of America and of other democracies, where foreign policy, you may have opinions about it, but you aren't necessarily going to vote on it. And so in the Philippines, Duterte is very popular. His China policy is unpopular. It doesn't really seem to matter enormously, right? That's not the bread and butter kind of issues of politics in the country. In other places, like in recent elections in Indonesia and Malaysia, kind of China issues popped up. And there are all kinds of complicated reasons why that's happened and what that's looked like. But it's not clear that's then going to become some enduring cleavage, right? They're bigger fish to fry, as it were, in the domestic politics of these countries. But there is potential for change that does get embedded within public opinion. So this is a really interesting, I'm also affiliated with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And they just had a great paper out on Chinese investment in the Philippines, which suggests there's possibilities for kind of shifts in policy. Basically, the Duterte government, according to 𝗣𝗂 piece, had to do business with Duterte's political allies, right? And avoid building relationships with the opposition or civil society. What this then means, right, is that this could generate long-run resentment and could backfire if and when power in Manila changes hands. We'll see what happens in the elections to come in the Philippines, whether the Duterte line continues, whatever that line is, or whether we see kind of oscillations that bring foreign policy more consistently in line with public opinion. But then I think we get this really interesting pattern that to me looks a lot like parts of Cold War South Asia, where there isn't this direct and sustained policies of either balancing or alignment, right? Countries are neither Pakistan, which is quite close to China, though also maintains ties with the United States, nor a country like Japan that is clearly part of the US alliance structure. Instead, countries like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, that are very important on their own terms, right? I'm always stunned by how few people study Bangladesh in the United States, and I'm among them. I don't really study Bangladesh, but huge country, very interesting, has managed to maintain benefits in multiple directions simultaneously. Similarly, I think it's fair to say at least Sri Lanka has pursued this policy of kind of being on adequate terms with lots of different players. Part of this is because the India issue has historically been much more important in these countries. But China can, or in India, I'm sorry, in Sri Lanka, there have been debates around China in the in domestic politics. Okay, now one country that again, this is a skim, but contemporary Nepal, we may be starting to see a breakdown of this. There may be kind of greater, more enduring polarization between different blocs, different parties aligned with different international actors. We'll see Nepal's politics are very complicated and fluid. But that's a country where we may be starting to see kind of more of a hardening and kind of creation of these blocs or these factions. So to conclude, what's new and what isn't? I think so far it's fair to say in the current period, for all of the rhetoric, this is vastly less intense competition than during the Cold War. I mean, there's nothing like, the greater Vietnam War, or Laos, Cambodia of the 1960s and 70s. These linkages are more complicated, right? There isn't this hard polarization into competing camps. Even countries like India or Japan have extensive economic relationships with China, as does the United States. But I do think there's potential for domestic polarization, potential in Myanmar and Nepal. I think it's clear that there's been a shift in India. What that turns into remains to be seen. And then there is the fact that nationalism creates the basis for backlash. And this has been true against China and against India and against the United States. So where might this lead us? There have been multiple trajectories that we're seeing here. There's no single kind of like Southern Asian or Asian response to the rise of China. Instead, very diverse trends, both in public opinion and in the link between public opinion and actual government policies, number one. Number two, and this is kind of my takeaway, I think, for people who want to think about how to think about these topics. A lot of what's going to be happening in the years to come is about the domestic politics of these swing states or these smaller, in air quotes, countries. That have agency and autonomy of their own. So thinking about this as a US-China chessboard that are moving chess pieces around and stuff, I think is misunderstanding where a lot of the impetus and agency will be coming from, which is these important countries that have their own both international and domestic reasons for pursuing different policies. And without understanding those, we're gonna have a really impoverished sense of how kind of international and domestic politics are playing out in contemporary Asia. So with that, I'm going to stop and look to Mark for questions. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Paul. It was a great presentation and we have many questions coming in. But I'll start with one that just came to my mind as you were closing your presentation, and that is to put it in a macro geopolitical context. How does Asia and South Asia compare to places like the Middle East, Central and South America, just in terms of volatility and the challenge that countries face dealing with these major powers?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm not, an expert on, almost anything in the world, but those. But I think one thing that's interesting and important about contemporary Asia, well, there are two things. One is there are multiple really powerful actors. This is not Central America in the shadow of American power and hegemony, right? So there's the Americans are floating around, the Japanese, very rich, powerful country, China, India, which is increasingly a player and working to be a player. The European Union and Europe have gotten interested, to a greater extent. And so there are a lot of options, a lot of potential partners, both in bilateral and multilateral kind of alignments that I think give these swing states more room to maneuver than countries that are kind of stuck in the shadow of a single dominant power. So I think that's one really important takeaway that I would have. There are just more options, there's more room to maneuver than in some of these historical comparisons that we might make. So I don't know if that answers the question.
It does, yeah, thank you. And another question that came to my mind during your presentation was, you have Gallup polls that you're looking at. What do countries like China and India and the United States look at to assess the receptivity of each one of those countries in the region?
I think that's a great question. I don't know for sure. I think they're looking at polling. And in fact, the US government has, in the past, has funded polling. A lot of my Cold War polling from India was funded by the United States Information Agency, which then gave money to the Indian Institute of Public Opinion, to run these surveys so that the Americans and others could figure out like what the Indian, at least the urban public, thought. I don't know the extent to which they're running like the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, or US government funded or linked agencies that also run polls, though I don't think, anyways. So there are government related things. I think a lot of it is like on the ground, people at embassies talking and trying to get a sense, right, of the receptivity, talking to politicians, trying to engage with civil society. And so I think, and then there are private diplomatic communications, right, in which the representatives of country X will say, these are my constraints, this is what I think my public thinks. Now there are pitfalls, I'll just riff for a second. There are pitfalls with all of these, which I think can lead to miscalculations. So governments can misrepresent themselves pretty easily and say, oh, I can't do this thing, the public, they won't let me do it. And you look around, you're like, is there any actual evidence of that? Maybe you just don't want to do it. And so you're using this as an excuse. When engaging with kind of other countries, it can be hard to do that in a representative way from an embassy. And so you may end up chatting to the people who speak good English and got their master's in international development at Oxford, right? And they're kind of the people like you, or whatever the equivalent would be, for in terms of comfort among Chinese or Japanese diplomats. And then public opinion polling is really useful, but it doesn't necessarily tell us how people are prioritizing things. So, okay, fine, I'm going to express an opinion about China or India or whatever. But will I engage in like costly actions to pursue that policy preference? I don't know, maybe not, right? I mean, you can run polls in the US that say all kinds of things. It doesn't mean that people necessarily vote on those or act on those. So there are all kinds of different sources of information, but you just want to be careful about reading too much into any single one of them, including these polls.
And based on the amount of activity we had on our Facebook page posting this particular lecture, both pro and against, however you want to take it, are social media companies like Facebook playing a role in helping countries assess what the temperature is?
That's a great question. I don't know what their relationship with governments are, to be honest with you. I think that Twitter has become kind of this international diplomatic battleground where different diplomats are on there and different, media influencers, social media influencers are on there. One thing with Twitter is I think people substantially overstate its relevance to like mass politics or the way in which it has any representation to public opinion, right? The number of Twitter users in India is dramatically smaller than Facebook or WhatsApp, right? It's just, there's no comparison at all. So like Twitter is this weird sphere unto itself. Certainly Facebook can matter a lot as kind of spreading opinions, but I don't know the extent to which like governments are using those. I really don't. Maybe they're tracking likes and dislikes and comments and stuff, but that's just, it's hard to know what governments make of those.
Yeah, it's complicated, and there are a lot of opportunities to analyze data if you can get your arms around it, I suppose. We've had a number of questions on China's Belt and Road Initiative. What are you seeing in these countries in terms of their receptivity and interest in working with China on Belt and Road?
Yeah, I think Belt and Road is one of these really interesting phenomena because it does directly touch on these domestic political questions, right? Because for a lot of countries in the region, the economic development is absolutely essential. in part for domestic reasons, right? To win power, you say, look, like I got stuff that was useful for your lives, your lived experiences. And so I think it really taps into potentially, right? And for leaders like Duterte, like this idea of development, right? Where things have run into challenges, I would say are a couple. First, skepticism from the Indians and the Americans and others, right? Seeing this as kind of a leading edge for Chinese influence. But then second, on the ground, backlash or complications, let's say. Backlash, say, could exist when Chinese laborers are brought in, right? Or when local populations believe that like natural resources are being extracted. So that's one kind of complication. Another is there aren't necessarily those issues, but local power holders can't agree on how to distribute the gains among themselves and their factions. Where should this, I don't know, new railroad go? Should it be in your district or my district, my province or your province? Who will be making decisions, right, about how these things are run? So that's more like, not necessarily doesn't have anything to do with these big foreign policy issues. It's more about the distribution of material benefits. So those are two of kind of or a couple of the challenges that I think have arisen alongside some of the real opportunities that a lot of these countries see. And that's why I think this is kind of a much more muddled situation than like a new Cold War, because even countries that would like to benefit from the rise of China also have certain concerns or domestic political imperatives at the same time in ways that just didn't really exist in like 1960s, in the 60s with US Chinese or US Soviet competition.
Do you feel more countries will take the path that you described Nepal is taking, which is kind of, or Sri Lanka, playing the India side, the China side, the US side, and trying to get the best advantage for themselves? And is it prudent to do that? Is it safe to do that? Is there a point where that will become unsustainable as a strategy?
I mean, these are like the biggest questions, right? So I don't have a great answer to them. I would say most countries would like to pursue that kind of policy. And I think even countries like India wanted to pursue that kind of policy. The question will be, where does that policy run into security competition, especially territorial disputes? I think that's one of the big limitations on this hedging strategy is if these disputes kind of flare up, it limits the room to pursue this hedging. And I know the India case the best, and I think that's at least one interpretation of what's happened, is the Indians would have loved to be part of this floating, multilateral, complex security environment, but at least from Delhi's perception is that China has kind of adopted a very hard line on the border and taken unilateral actions. And so they can't pursue that more floating, multipolar strategy to the same extent. Is there a point at which that's no longer possible? I think the point at which that's no longer possible is when these outside options would disappear, when you're basically stuck with a choice of kind of the hegemony of a single power, and you decide to kind of align with it because you have no other choices. I'm not sure that's likely, because there's so many large countries in the region and large countries from the outside interested in the region that I guess I see some degree of enduring space, room for maneuver. Again, could be totally wrong with all of this, but my sense is there's more room to maneuver than like a strict bipolar kind of clash of systems conceptualization.
Your space may not be or may be prone to talk hypotheticals, but there was one question that came in early in the registrations that was a China invading Taiwan hypothetical. And the most important part of that question is, how would countries in Southern Asia, Southeast Asia respond to such an event? Do you have a sense?
Well, I mean, I don't think it would be welcome for the most part, right? War in general is not, interstate war, conflict, these are not going to be welcome. Obviously, country by country, I can't answer that, in detail. I think most of these countries have very limited abilities to do much about these things, right? I mean, Nepal is not sending carrier battle groups to kind of the South China Sea to do anything, right? So to me, like the big questions about Taiwan seem to center, and I'm not a Taiwan expert at all, on kind of this interplay between China, Taiwan, the US, and to some extent, I guess Japan is getting more involved in that space. I think in general, though, like anything that is seen as destabilizing the environment, generating war, undercutting supply chains would not be viewed very favorably, right? I don't have data on that I can point to, but that would be my assumption.
Generally unfavorable. Okay, that's good enough.
I don't think that's like a controversial. I don't think that's a particularly controversial statement. I hope, but
yeah, no, that's a good one. You do have a fellow professor, Dr. Alex Arfianto, I hope I said that correctly, RSIS Nanyang Tech University in Singapore, who has two questions, but I'll ask the first. How do you see ASEAN's role as a potential regional institutional balancer for the great powers competition in Southeast Asia?
Okay, so hello, it's nice to see you, or virtually. I'm not an ASEAN expert. So again, this is an early project. I don't want to get out over my skis here. I think ASEAN has a role in all of this. I'm not sure that, I think in the face of really intense US-China geopolitical competition, it would be harder and harder for ASEAN to kind of maintain itself as autonomous or insulated. I don't know the extent to which we'll get there. So ASEAN seems to have a role that countries of the region, or leaders of countries at least, value. And so it could continue to do some things. I don't think it's like a block unto itself that will be able to entirely insulate itself from these broader geopolitical dynamics. But if the leaders of the countries believe ASEAN is useful, then my sense is to think that there's something useful about it that is likely to endure as long as geopolitical competition and these multiple sides don't put too much pressure on these countries to choose sides in some kind of bipolar competition. I do think we're seeing real limits to what ASEAN is able to do in the Myanmar crisis. I have my own take on Myanmar, so others will be happy to disagree, I'm sure. But I think, you know, there's been essentially not much push, let's put it that way, of substance out of ASEAN. Now, I think that's because a lot of ASEAN leaders don't really want there to be much of a push. So maybe ASEAN is working perfectly in that case, but certainly not as like this autonomous block unto itself.
Great, thank you. One of the audience members asked the question, asked if you could speak to the concept of the Asian century. That's more of, you know, maybe interpret what the concept of the Asian century actually means.
So I've heard that used in a variety of ways, and you know, the questioner may have a different one in mind. I think at least in the United States, the Asian century tends to be about the kind of shift of power, both economic and military, toward Asia, broadly understood, over the course of the 21st century. And it's clear that's happening. And that really matters. The rise of China, the rise of India, right? The continuing relevance of Japan, huge countries like Bangladesh and Indonesia. And so I think that is ongoing. You know, there is, and so I guess the question is, what does that mean? Well, it means that more and more attention of the world is focused on Asia. I think that's clearly happening. I don't know beyond that what it means, right? Like politics will be happening in Asia, economics will be happening in Asia. I'm not sure that there's anything that then flows from that that's determinative. Like this is what the Asian century will look like, or this is what it will look like. Like you can imagine a world in which everybody basically gets along amidst tensions and get rich, and that's great. You can imagine a world in which countries get old before they get rich, right? And we see the demographic problems facing a variety of Asian countries that kind of limit the trajectory of the Asian century. You know, even India, which has a relatively young population, is facing this challenge. And then you look at the age pyramids in some of these other countries, really kind of worrisome as a long-term constraint. You can imagine a world in which there's like massive warfare and huge, you know, really devastating problems, throw in climate change. So it is the Asian century in some undeniable sense. I'm not sure in of itself that means anything in particular, to be blunt. So pay attention to Asia, yes. Beyond that, I'm not sure it tells us anything super specific.
Great segue to the next question. You know, we are in Hong Kong, and as I always say, I would be remiss if I didn't ask this question from one of the attendees of the program, which is really, you know, under the current scenario with the central government tightening its control over Hong Kong, does that provide a hint or some insight to other countries in the region about how China might behave?
So I can speak most clearly to India on this. You know, this has been portrayed as a sign of the central government's intent to kind of dominate, centralize, and kind of homogenize China. And, you know, I'm sure people, I don't know what's happening on the Facebook page, but I'm sure people will disagree with this. But I think it's fair to say from the perspective of at least Indian policymakers, there's a vision of, there's an idea that China has become increasingly revisionist, right? That it's out to push, it's stronger, it's bigger, it knows that, and it's kind of pushing its advantages outward. The extent to which kind of Chinese policymakers agree with that and are worried about that perception is, of course, a totally different issue. But at least from the perception of some outsiders, Hong Kong is part of this broader set of policies that are worrisome.
Excellent, thank you. One of the audience members asked if you were in the Biden administration, if you were advising the Biden administration, what regional policies would you recommend to enlist local support in countering Chinese attempts to expand its influence in the region?
So I think that's a great question. It's not one with an easy answer. I guess and I'm a professor, so I like point out problems without offering solutions sometimes. So let me start with that. I think that countries in the region are not necessarily going to be receptive to this idea of a clash of democracy versus autocracy for a variety of reasons. Like it doesn't necessarily resonate with how a lot of at least leaders in these countries are thinking about it. So I'd tone down that if I were them. And I think I guess one way to think about this, my colleague 𝗣𝗂𝗹𝗦𝘁 at the Carnegie Endowment has written a really nice set of work on this, is one role for the US is not as like a direct alternative, right? Say, do this instead of that, but to say, look what we have to offer, which is pretty good, right? So, high quality infrastructure at good debt terms, for instance, or, more reliable contracting, or, easier coordination with other countries. Like this is what we have to offer, not like stay away from the Chinese. I think that might be better received, right? Because it's not like the US is beloved in a number of these places, right? I mean, obviously in places like Pakistan, the US is viewed very negatively, and in plenty of other countries, it's not viewed especially favorably. In some cases by governments, right? It's seen as preachy and domineering, in some cases by publics, where it's, well, I guess also seen as preachy and domineering and hypocritical. So I guess I wouldn't be preaching too much. I think there's a tendency within the Biden administration to be a little preachy, like they view themselves as restoring American global leadership, but it's not clear that a lot of people see that the same way, especially outside of Western Europe. So I would tone that down a little bit and think about this more as kind of leveraging areas of American advantage without forcing choices or kind of making this highly ideological.
I always wonder personally whether the Biden administration rhetoric in the region, in particular in Asia, is not meant more for a local US domestic audience than it is for this region and the countries in it in particular.
I mean, I'll just riff for 1 second on this, which is I think you're going to see US, Asia, and China specifically policy become an object of really intense domestic political dispute in the United States. I think it's already happened, but the critiques from the right, Marco Rubio, Tom Cotton, kind of Josh Hawley, the like up and coming young Republican hawks, they're basically saying Biden's still soft on China, China Joe, right? And Biden's here saying like, I'm tough on China, I'm restoring American global leadership. And they're like, yeah, we're not buying any of that. Like, we need to be even tougher. So I think it's gonna be very hard for the US to offer like a coherent long-term strategy in the face of this kind of increasingly intense domestic political competition. So all the things I've talked about, other countries apply to the US and more, in spades.
I was really surprised at your graphic on Sri Lanka and how low the US was reflected in terms of the general support of US policy, I guess, in Sri Lanka relative to India and the others, China.
I mean, it's just one snapshot, right? So I don't want to overplay it out, though it's a good organization. I can look at the Sri Lanka US public approval data. I was looking at that the other day. I just forget what it is. It's not dramatically good or dramatically bad. I think in the Sri Lankan case, a lot, the US kind of has popped up at various points to talk about things like human rights, and then it disappears for a while and goes off and does other things. Or when it talks about human rights, it's not viewed as very popular among supporters of the government. Plus, these other countries are a lot closer. America's very, very far away.
Yeah, I was going to just say that. Just does proximity really matter in this equation or in the formula?
Yeah, I mean,
in the region?
It's hard to avoid that being really important. For a country like Nepal, the rise of China presents some really interesting opportunities because previously it was stuck under India's shadow. Right. For Bangladesh, a country that is trying to develop economically, like you don't want to be closing off opportunities for economic development and growth. You don't want to be making hard choices that close off things that you believe your citizens will need. And at the same time, for other countries, and some of those countries as well, Nepal and Bangladesh, among many others, governments can get benefits from these multiple relationships in terms of, whether it's military sales or political cover or, a variety of other potential benefits as well.
There was one good question that came in from our Zoom registration audience. How much is China's influence on Southern Asia borrowed from the playbooks of the past great powers? And I'm assuming they're talking about the United States and maybe Great Britain.
That's a great question. I don't know how much would intentionally be done or not from the Chinese perspective, but certainly, I mean, the Americans and the British before them, right, have aimed to find friendly governments and support them. And this continues. It's now different because there are more outside options, right? But if you look at American policy during the Cold War in Southeast Asia, it's like, who are our guys and how can we support them? And this often was done with, covert action, supporting insurgencies, supporting coups, like really, repressive, bloody stuff. And we're not there yet, I think, for the most part. The Chinese backing for the Cambodian regime, begins to look like these are our guys, right? Maybe we'll see this in Myanmar. And so to that extent, maybe you start to see echoes. Certainly economics have always been central to all of these relationships. I think though, I don't know how to think about the relationship here between the geoeconomics and the geostrategy, because it is a very different set of economic relationships than in these previous great power kind of dynamics, right? Where there's much more trade and flows of money and goods across borders than in any of these, I think, I could be wrong, but than in any of these previous periods. And that just changes equations in ways that I think make it hard to directly compare like apples for apples.
We've had several questions related to, and maybe you can just touch on, China's influence vis-a-vis Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and the Philippines.
Okay, so like I am really on the edge of my expertise here. So I just I already had that caveat early on. And there is polling data on some of these countries. I just didn't focus on them because of the main focus of my book is going to be on these like kind of democratic or quasi-democratic countries. So I don't know about polling. My amateur sense, open to be corrected here, is the Cambodian government relies and engages with China pretty extensively. There is some pushback, there is negotiating, but it's a close relationship. Laos was previously, my understanding, very much more aligned to the Soviets and then opens to China much more dramatically. And there's a lot of natural resource extraction stuff that goes on now, Chinese tourism. Vietnam is this really interesting case. It's a party state, right? So it's not, this is again where like the clash of democracy and autocracy may at 30,000 feet up, the Biden people may see it that way. But when you start looking at specific countries, things get way more complicated. So Vietnam is not a democracy, but historically, obviously, is willing to stand up to China for what it perceives as its own interest. There's been a war, territorial disputes. Like, I think you could see Vietnam as a country that can't hedge as much as you might like economically, because there are these security concerns that push it more toward a loose alignment with countries like India that are worried about China, but also don't want to cut the cord on economic exchanges. I don't know what the polling shows in Vietnam, and so I can't speak to that. The Philippines I talked about a little bit is really interesting, where you see gaps between public opinion and policy. A lot of this is Duterte being Duterte, and so it's hard to know kind of what things will look like in new administrations, how much continuity or change there will be. But the Philippines is interesting in part because it has, relatively high approval of the US, a long relationship, but also strong sentiments and strands of deep hostility and skepticism toward the United States, which, let us not forget, was a brutal colonial occupier that took over the place and repressed rebellions with, blood, and then has propped up, various elites, kleptocratic elites. So like there are a lot of different strands within these countries. Even when the top line looks broadly positive or negative, there's a lot going on underneath.
Mm-hmm. One question, if we go to the other side of the globe and talk a little bit about Afghanistan and the U.S. military's withdrawal from Afghanistan and what impact that might have in kind of opening the way for China to, come into that theater. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I have thoughts. I don't know if they're right, but I would be very surprised if China's excited about Afghanistan descending into increasingly intense civil war. I mean, I saw the Chinese have, I don't know the details of what this was, but basically telling citizens to either get out or proceed with great caution because of growing violence. I don't see reasons why we would expect China to be really excited about the return of the Taliban. They might be happy to see American combat forces out, but that's different than it's good for Afghanistan to be, a failed state. So I mean, maybe there are opportunities, but I'm not sure external players are going to, like China or India, are going to benefit greatly from a descent into increasingly intense civil war. So, I mean, I did see there have been a couple articles in the U.S. press recently, which is like, withdrawing from Afghanistan will not help the U.S. counter China, and like, I guess a lot of that hinges on whether you think China is poised to gain all these advantages from a chaotic, bloody, and tragic Afghanistan. I'm skeptical of that. I think for a couple of reasons. One is I don't think China has evinced great interest in Islamist armed groups on its borders, right? And two, even in terms of things like commercial or mineral resource extraction opportunities, war is not a great environment for that kind of thing, even if you just want to do business.
Good question here from an audience member asking you whether you believe the flow of intellectuals and students from South Asia to the US will shift toward China in the near future.
That's a great question. I think certainly in Pakistan, there have been efforts at that and kind of increasing exchanges. And I think for other countries of the region that are not India, China provides some really interesting opportunities. So I don't want to sit here and be like the Americans say, you know, don't go do things with China, right? If I were an up and coming Sri Lankan student who had an opportunity to do science research at a top Chinese institute, that's an extraordinary opportunity. I think India is a different story. And, you know, it wasn't like there was this massive flow anyways. India's intellectuals and, you know, universities have generally looked either to Europe and the US or to countries like, you know, Singapore within Asia. And I don't see that changing in the direction of China, if anything, quite the opposite. So I don't know what the flows look like. I think under a second Trump administration, you would see even more challenges for the US in bringing people to the US, which I think is one of the great self-own goals of American policies to make it harder for people to come to the US. Personally, I mean, I benefit enormously from having students from Asia and you know, India, Pakistan, elsewhere come here. I learned so much from them. So I think there will be more. How much more, I don't know. A lot depends on US policy. And also I think, again, not thinking just in terms of the US and China, but a lot of international students are going to places like Australia, Singapore, the Gulf, and Europe. So it's not just like the US versus China. There are all these other great universities and educational opportunities around the world that you could equally see flows going to.
If anybody in our audience would like to come to the University of Chicago and study with you at the CIR, what's the best way to reach you?
Go to cir.uchicago.edu, and there's all kinds of stuff about applications, the admissions process, all of that. We'd love to hear from you. So that's my one pitch.
And then they can also follow you on Twitter, from what I understand. You have quite a number of followers on Twitter.
Yeah, I'm at 𝗣𝘂𝗹 on Twitter. So, you know, you can come yell at me on Twitter or not or whatever.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. We've come to the end of our program tonight. So many great questions. We're going to send those questions to you, Professor, so you have all of them and you can think about all of them as you continue your research. And we hope to have you back again, and maybe somebody else from within the CIR. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the US side of this equation in Southern Asia. We'd love to do that and love to have you back. So thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for everybody taking the time. Appreciate it.
Our pleasure. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. We have a brief survey or a brief poll related to tonight's program for the audience on Zoom that's going to pop up on your screen if it hasn't already. Please complete it while I tell you a little bit more about next week's UN Campus program. Next Thursday is our next 1.5 degree climate change mini-series program on oceans at on June 8th at 8 p.m. We will host Dr. Ruth Pedrosa Pamies from the University of Chicago's Marine Biological Laboratory on her lecture, Tropical Cyclone Activity and its Impact on Marine Ecosystems. We already have hundreds of attendees registered for that program, so I hope you sign up for your virtual seat and join us for this very timely climate change program. We look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much for joining us.